The massive silverback charges through the underbrush, its thunderous roar echoing across the misty mountains of Central Africa. Emma Hayes stands frozen, her back against a towering mahogany tree, as 800 pounds of pure muscle and fury barrels toward her. The gorilla's eyes burn with primal rage, knuckles pounding the earth like war drums. This is it, the moment that will determine whether Emma lives or dies in one of the world's most remote wilderness areas. But just as the silverback's massive fist swings toward her head, another figure emerges from the shadows. A female gorilla, smaller but equally fierce, crashes into the male with bone-shattering force. The two titans collide in an explosion of earth and vegetation, their battle cries piercing the jungle air like ancient war songs. Emma watches in stunned disbelief as her unlikely protector, a mother gorilla she once saved from drowning, now fights to save her life. Blood spatters the forest floor as the two gorillas grapple, their powerful limbs locked in mortal combat. The female is wounded, favoring her left arm, but she refuses to yield. She's repaying a debt that began with a single act of courage by a human stranger. How did a wildlife researcher from Colorado end up in the middle of a guerrilla war? How did she forge an impossible bond with one of nature's most dangerous creatures? And why is this mother gorilla willing to die to protect her? To understand this incredible story, we need to go back to where it all began, 3 months ago, when Emma Hayes made a decision that would change everything. But before we dive into this amazing journey, I need you to do something for me. Drop your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this incredible story reaches around the globe. And if you love stories about the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals, hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold, because we're just getting started with this mind-blowing tale. 3 months earlier, Emma Hayes was living what most people would consider a dream life. At 32 years old, she had already established herself as one of the world's leading primatologists, with a PhD from Stanford and research expeditions to every continent where great apes existed. Her published papers on gorilla social behavior had revolutionized how scientists understood these magnificent creatures. But Emma wasn't your typical academic researcher who preferred the safety of university labs. She was a field researcher in the truest sense. Someone who believed you couldn't truly understand an animal unless you lived among them, breathed the same air, and faced the same dangers. Her colleagues often called her reckless, but Emma called it necessary. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length auburn hair, usually tied back in a practical ponytail, Emma had the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of patient observation. Her green eyes missed nothing, a skill that had kept her alive in some of the world's most dangerous wilderness areas. She could read the subtle body language of a silverback gorilla from 50 yards away, could predict weather patterns by watching cloud formations, and could navigate through dense jungle using only natural landmarks. Emma's obsession with gorillas began during her childhood in rural Colorado, where she spent countless hours watching wildlife documentaries with her grandfather. He was a former park ranger who had filled her young mind with stories of animals displaying almost human-like intelligence and emotion. When Emma was 12, her grandfather showed her footage of Dian Fossey's work with mountain gorillas in Rwanda. That night, she declared she would dedicate her life to understanding these incredible creatures. Now, 15 years later, Emma had traveled to the remote Sangha Trinational Park, spanning across Cameroon, Central African Republic, and Republic of the Congo. This was one of the last true wilderness areas on Earth, where ancient forests stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, and where some of the world's most endangered gorilla populations still roamed free. She had been working alone at a research station deep in the Cameroonian section of the park for 6 weeks, collecting data on gorilla feeding patterns and social interactions. The isolation didn't bother her. In fact, she preferred it. Out here, away from the noise and politics of academia, she could focus entirely on her work. Emma's daily routine was methodical and disciplined. She woke before dawn, checked her equipment, and prepared for another day of tracking and observation. Her temporary home was a modest wooden cabin that the Park Service had built for researchers, equipped with solar panels for basic electricity and a satellite phone for emergencies. The nearest human settlement was over 60 miles away, through terrain that would challenge even experienced jungle guides. But Emma thrived in this environment. She had learned to read the forest like others read books. Every sound, every scent, every movement of leaves told her something about the hidden life around her. She knew which tree species the gorillas preferred for nesting, which water sources they visited at different times of day, and how weather changes affected their behavior. Her research was particularly focused on maternal behavior among mountain gorillas. How did mothers teach their young to survive? How did they protect them from predators? What happened when families were separated by human encroachment or natural disasters? These questions had driven Emma's work for years, but she had no idea how personally invested in the answers she was about to become. On this particular morning in late September, Emma prepared for what she thought would be just another routine day of observation. She packed her waterproof notebook, telephoto camera, GPS device, and enough food and water for a full day in the field. Her plan was to track a small family group she had been monitoring, an adult female with 2 juveniles who had established their territory, along a river system about 3 miles from the research station. As Emma laced up her hiking boots and adjusted her backpack, she looked out at the morning mist rising from the forest canopy. The air was thick with humidity and alive with the sounds of awakening wildlife. Birds calling from the treetops, insects buzzing in the undergrowth, and somewhere in the distance, the haunting calls of the gorillas she had come here to study. She had no way of knowing that this day would begin a journey that would test every skill she had learned, every instinct she had developed, and every assumption she held about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Emma Hayes was about to discover that sometimes the line between observer and participant, between researcher and subject, between human and animal, becomes impossible to draw. The forest was calling, and Emma answered, walking into a story that would change her life forever. The morning trek through the dense forest had been routine until Emma heard the sound that changed everything. A desperate, high-pitched cry that cut through the usual symphony of jungle sounds like a blade. She froze mid-step, her trained ear immediately recognizing the distress call of a young gorilla. Emma had been following a well-worn animal path that ran parallel to the Sangha River, one of the major waterways that carved through this ancient forest. The rainy season had been particularly intense this year, and the river was running higher and faster than she had ever seen it. The usually gentle waters had transformed into a churning torrent of brown water carrying fallen trees, debris, and anything else unfortunate enough to be caught in its path. The cry came again, closer this time, more urgent. Emma dropped her backpack and pushed through the thick vegetation toward the sound, branches catching at her clothing and thorns scraping her arms. Her heart pounded as she recognized the particular desperation in that call. This wasn't just any distress sound. This was the cry of a young animal in mortal danger, breaking through the last wall of vegetation. Emma emerged onto the muddy riverbank and immediately spotted the source of the cries. About 30 feet from shore, in the middle of the raging river, a young mountain gorilla was struggling for its life. The baby gorilla, Emma estimated it couldn't be more than 8 months old, was clinging desperately to a partially submerged log that was being battered by the current. Its tiny hands, barely large enough to grip the slippery bark, were losing their hold with each wave that crashed over its small body. The little gorilla's eyes were wide with terror as it called out for help that seemed nowhere to come. Emma's scientific mind immediately began calculating the situation. The water temperature was probably around 55 degrees, cold enough to quickly sap the strength from a small body. The current was moving at least 12 miles per hour, fast enough to slam the baby against rocks or drag it under fallen trees. And most critically, Infant gorillas, unlike their human counterparts, were not natural swimmers. In water, they were as helpless as human babies. But how had the infant ended up in the middle of a raging river? As Emma scanned the opposite bank, she found part of her answer. A large tree had recently fallen across the river, its massive trunk creating a natural bridge. The baby must have been crossing with its family when it lost its footing and fell into the rushing water below. The log it was clinging to had probably been part of that same tree, torn away by the current. Time was running out. Even as Emma watched, the baby's grip was weakening. Each wave that crashed over its small head seemed to diminish its strength a little more. The log itself was slowly rotating in the current, threatening to roll over completely and trap the infant underneath. Emma's training kicked in. She had spent years studying gorilla behavior, understanding their physical capabilities and limitations. She knew that adult gorillas, despite their incredible strength on land, were generally afraid of deep water. Their muscular bodies made them poor swimmers, and their instinctual fear of drowning was strong. This baby's family had probably watched helplessly from the shore before being forced to retreat to safety. The rational part of Emma's mind told her to document what she was seeing, to observe and record this tragedy as part of the natural order. This was nature, red in tooth and claw, playing out one of its countless daily dramas. But another part of her mind, the part that had been shaped by her grandfather's stories and her own deep empathy for these creatures, was already calculating angles, distances, and possibilities. The baby's cries were becoming weaker now, more spaced out. Its small chest was heaving with exhaustion, and its grip on the log was failing. In another minute, maybe two at most, it would lose its hold and disappear beneath the muddy water. Emma looked around desperately for some tool, some rope or branch that might help her reach the infant from shore. But the riverbank was steep and muddy, offering no purchase for any kind of rescue attempt from the safety of land. The log with the baby was being pushed further from shore with each passing second. There was only one option, and Emma knew it even as every survival instinct she possessed screamed against it. The water was freezing, the current was deadly, and she had no safety equipment. If she went into that river, she might not come out alive. But as she looked at the terrified baby gorilla fighting for its life, she realized she had no choice. Emma had dedicated her career to understanding these magnificent creatures. She had spent countless hours watching them care for their young, protect their families, and navigate the challenges of their dangerous world. Now one of them needed her help, not as a scientist, not as an observer, but as one living being helping another. She began pulling off her hiking boots, her hands shaking with adrenaline and cold. The baby gorilla was running out of time, and if she was going to act, it had to be now. Emma Hayes, who had built her reputation on careful observation and calculated risk, was about to take the biggest gamble of her life. The river roared its challenge. The baby cried its desperate plea, and Emma made her choice. Emma's body hit the icy water with a shock that drove all the air from her lungs. The current immediately seized her, far stronger than she had anticipated from the shore. Within seconds, she was fighting not just to reach the baby gorilla, but to keep her own head above water. The river was a living thing, malevolent and hungry, pulling her downstream even as she fought to angle toward the middle where the infant clung to its precarious refuge. Emma was a strong swimmer. She had trained in the cold mountain lakes of Colorado, but nothing had prepared her for the raw power of this African river in flood debris. Slammed into her as she fought the current. A branch scraped along her ribs, drawing blood. A chunk of mud and vegetation hit her shoulder, with enough force to temporarily numb her left arm. But Emma kept swimming, using a modified side stroke that allowed her to keep the baby gorilla in sight while making slow progress across the current. The baby saw her coming. Its cries changed pitch, becoming more urgent but somehow more hopeful. Those large, dark eyes, so achingly human in their expression, locked onto Emma's face as she struggled closer. The infant was shivering violently now, its small body losing the battle against hypothermia. 20 feet, 15, 10. Emma reached out, her frozen fingers almost touching the log, when disaster struck. The log, which had been slowly rotating in the current, suddenly rolled completely over. The baby gorilla disappeared beneath the churning surface. "No!" Emma screamed, diving beneath the muddy water. Visibility was zero in the murky current, but she swept her arms frantically through the water, hoping to make contact with the small body. Her lungs burned. Her limbs were going numb from the cold, but she kept searching. Just as she was about to surface for air, her hand brushed against something soft and warm. The baby! Emma grabbed desperately and managed to get her arm around the infant's chest. It was unconscious, its small body limp and cold, but she could feel a faint heartbeat against her forearm, breaking the surface. Emma found herself further downstream than ever, the shoreline a blur of green vegetation rushing past. The baby gorilla hung limp in her arms, water streaming from its mouth and nose. She had to get them both to safety, and fast. That's when she saw it, a fallen tree trunk that had lodged between two boulders, creating a small island of relative calm in the middle of the river. It was their only chance. Using her last reserves of strength, Emma angled toward the makeshift refuge. The current slammed both of them against the trunk with brutal force, but somehow Emma managed to haul herself and the baby up onto the narrow, slippery surface. They were out of the immediate danger of drowning, but they were still stranded in the middle of a raging river, and the baby gorilla wasn't breathing. Emma's medical training from her field research kicked in. She turned the infant onto its side and began pressing gently on its chest, trying to expel water from its lungs. "Come on," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Come on, little one." After what felt like an eternity, the baby coughed, water streaming from its mouth, and took a gasping breath. Its eyes fluttered open, looking directly into Emma's face. For a moment, human and gorilla simply stared at each other, both shivering, both alive against all odds. But their relief was short-lived. Emma's rescue attempt had created a new problem. They were now both trapped on a log in the middle of a dangerous river, with no apparent way to reach either shore safely. Emma was trying to calculate their options when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very air around them. She looked toward the shore they had drifted from and saw a sight that would be burned into her memory forever. Standing on the riverbank, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was the largest female gorilla Emma had ever seen. Even from a distance of 40 yards, the animal's massive size and obvious distress were unmistakable. This was clearly the baby's mother, and she had found them. The mother gorilla was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. She stood nearly 6 feet tall when upright, her muscular frame covered in thick, dark fur that glistened with morning dew. Her face bore the weathered wisdom of years in the wild, but her eyes burned with a fury that made Emma's heart race with fear. The great ape moved along the shoreline, keeping pace with the log as it slowly drifted downstream. Her calls became increasingly agitated, deep, powerful vocalizations that spoke of desperate maternal grief and rage. To her, Emma wasn't a rescuer. She was a threat, a human who had somehow stolen her baby and was now holding it captive in the middle of the river. Emma understood the mother's perspective. In the gorilla's mind, this strange human had appeared at the exact moment her baby disappeared from the fallen tree. Now the human and her infant were together on a log in the middle of the river. The logical conclusion for any protective mother was that the human was responsible for the danger to her child. "I'm trying to help," Emma called out, knowing the words were meaningless to the gorilla, but needing to say them anyway. "I'm not going to hurt your baby." The baby gorilla, still weak and shivering, seemed to hear its mother's calls. It lifted its small head and made soft vocalizations in response, the quiet grunts and chirps that infant gorillas use to communicate with their mothers. But it made no attempt to leave Emma's protective embrace. Perhaps it sensed that the human had saved its life, or perhaps it was simply too weak to move. Emma found herself in an impossible situation. She was stranded on a log with a baby gorilla while its 300-pound mother watched from shore, interpreting Emma's every move as a potential threat. The current was slowly carrying them further downstream, toward a section of the river Emma knew was filled with rocks and rapids. They had to reach shore soon, or they would both face new dangers. But how could she get the baby back to its mother without endangering all three of them? The answer came from an unexpected source: the baby gorilla itself. Despite its weakness, the infant began making more insistent calls toward shore, clearly wanting to return to its mother. It looked up at Emma with those expressive dark eyes, and she saw something remarkable there. Not fear, not suspicion, but what appeared to be trust. Emma made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Moving very slowly and deliberately, she began to position herself at the edge of the log closest to shore. The current was weaker here, in the lee of some partially submerged boulders, but it was still dangerous. "Your baby needs you," she called to the mother gorilla, her voice carrying across the water. "And I need you to trust me." The mother had moved further downstream, tracking their progress along the shoreline. She had stopped her agitated calling and was now watching intently, as if trying to understand what Emma was planning to do. Emma looked down at the baby gorilla in her arms. The infant had stopped shivering quite so violently, and its breathing seemed stronger. It was going to survive if they could get it back to safety and warmth. But the next few minutes would determine whether any of them would live through this encounter. Very carefully, Emma lowered herself into the water while keeping the baby gorilla pressed against her chest. The current immediately tried to pull them away from the log, but Emma fought to stay in the relatively calm water near the boulders. She began swimming slowly toward shore, moving at an angle that would compensate for the current's push downstream. The mother gorilla watched every stroke, every movement. As Emma drew closer to shore, the massive female moved down to the water's edge, her huge hands clenching and unclenching with nervous energy. Emma could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the internal struggle between protective instinct and maternal need. 20 yards from shore, the baby gorilla began calling more insistently to its mother. The infant was clearly recognizing familiar scents and sounds, wanting desperately to return to the safety of its family. But it also seemed reluctant to leave Emma, perhaps sensing that she was the reason it was still alive. 15 yards. 10. Emma's feet finally touched bottom in the shallower water near shore, but she was still too far away to safely hand over the baby. The mother gorilla had moved to within 20 feet of the water's edge, close enough that Emma could see every detail of her massive face, every emotion playing across those expressive features. 5 yards from shore, Emma stopped. This was the moment of truth. She had to trust that this wild, powerful animal would understand her intentions. She had to believe that the bond between mother and child would overcome the natural mistrust between species. Very slowly, Emma extended her arms, holding the baby gorilla out toward its mother. The infant immediately began reaching toward the shore, making soft calling sounds. The mother gorilla took a step closer to the water, then another. She was now close enough that Emma could see the deep intelligence in her eyes, the careful evaluation of this unprecedented situation. "He's safe," Emma whispered. "Take your baby." What happened next defied everything Emma thought she knew about gorilla behavior. Instead of charging into the water to reclaim her infant, the mother gorilla sat down at the water's edge and extended her own massive arms toward Emma. It was a gesture of invitation, not aggression, a request for Emma to bring the baby to her, rather than demanding that she come and take it. Emma waded forward until she was standing in knee-deep water, just a few feet from one of the most powerful creatures on Earth. The mother gorilla was even more impressive up close, her thick arms easily capable of breaking Emma in half, her massive hands equipped with fingers that could crush bone. But those hands reached out with infinite gentleness as Emma carefully transferred the baby into its mother's embrace. The reunion was heart-wrenching in its tenderness. The mother gorilla immediately began grooming her infant, checking every inch of its small body for injuries while making soft, comforting vocalizations. The baby pressed itself against its mother's warm fur, finally safe after its terrifying ordeal. But then, something extraordinary happened. The mother gorilla looked up at Emma, who was still standing in the shallow water, and made a sound Emma had never heard before in all her years of gorilla research. It was soft, almost musical, a vocalization that seemed to convey gratitude, recognition, and something deeper. The two females, human and gorilla, so different, yet united by their shared experience, looked into each other's eyes for a long moment. Emma felt a connection that transcended species, a recognition of one mother acknowledging another's courage. Because in that moment, by risking her life to save the infant, Emma had become something more than a researcher or an observer. She had become part of this family's story. The mother gorilla rose slowly to her feet, cradling her baby against her chest. She looked at Emma one more time, that strange musical sound coming from deep in her throat, and then began walking back into the forest. But instead of disappearing immediately into the dense vegetation, she stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked back. As if making sure Emma was following, Emma stumbled out of the river, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. She retrieved her backpack from where she had dropped it and began the long walk back to her research station. But as she made her way through the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to keep pace with her progress through the trees. The mother gorilla was following her. By the time Emma reached her cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the forest canopy. She was exhausted, hypothermic, and emotionally drained from the day's events. All she wanted was to get warm, eat something hot, and process what had happened. But as she fumbled with the key to her cabin door, a sound from the forest made her freeze. It was the same soft, musical vocalization she had heard from the mother gorilla by the river. Emma turned slowly and peered into the darkening forest. At first, she saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then her eyes adjusted, and she spotted a large, dark shape sitting motionless about 50 yards away. The mother gorilla had indeed followed her home. She was sitting at the base of a large tree, her baby nestled safely in her arms, simply watching Emma. There was no aggression in her posture, no threat implied by her presence. She was just there, waiting, watching, as if she had appointed herself Emma's protector. Emma stood on her porch for several minutes, human and gorilla regarding each other across the small clearing that surrounded the research station. The baby appeared to be sleeping peacefully, clearly recovered from its ordeal in the river. The mother showed no signs of leaving. Finally, Emma spoke softly into the gathering darkness. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me, for letting me help." The gorilla made no sound in response, but Emma thought she saw a slight movement of that massive head. Perhaps a nod, perhaps just a trick of the fading light. When Emma looked again after unlocking her door, the shadows had swallowed the forest, and the gorillas were gone. But Emma knew they weren't really gone. As she heated soup on her small camping stove and wrapped herself in warm blankets, she could feel eyes watching her from the darkness outside. The mother gorilla had claimed this territory, and now Emma was part of it. The rescue at the river had forged a bond that neither of them fully understood. But both of them felt. Emma fell asleep that night to the sound of soft, grunting calls from the forest, the sounds of a mother gorilla settling down for the night with her baby, keeping watch over the strange human who had risked her life to save them both. The real story was just beginning. Emma woke before dawn to the sound of screaming. Not the calls of her gorilla guardians, but human screams, the kind that spoke of terror and pain. She bolted upright in her narrow bunk, instantly alert despite having been in deep sleep moments before. The screaming came again, closer this time, accompanied by the unmistakable crack of a high-powered rifle. Emma's blood ran cold. Poachers. In all her years of field research, this was the scenario she had feared most. Armed hunters in the protected wilderness. seeking gorilla meat for bushmeat markets or infant gorillas for illegal wildlife trade. Emma grabbed her satellite phone and immediately tried to call the park rangers, but there was no signal. The thick canopy and remoteness of her location made communication unreliable at the best of times. And now, when she needed help most, the technology failed her completely. Another gunshot echoed through the forest, and Emma heard something that made her heart stop. The distinctive alarm calls of mountain gorillas under attack. Her gorillas, the mother and baby who had become part of her daily world over the past 2 weeks, were in mortal danger. Emma threw on her boots and grabbed the only weapon she had, a flare gun designed for emergency signaling. It wasn't much against armed poachers, but it might create enough distraction to help the gorillas escape. She burst out of her cabin and ran toward the sounds of conflict, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene she discovered in a small clearing 200 yards from her station was like something from a nightmare. 3 men in camouflage clothing were attempting to corner a family group of gorillas. Not just her mother and baby, but an entire extended family of 7 animals, including a massive silverback male who was clearly the patriarch of the group. The lead poacher, a tall man with a grizzled beard and cold eyes, held a military-style assault rifle trained on the silverback. His 2 companions were armed with machetes and nets, clearly planning to capture the baby gorillas alive for sale to private collectors. Dead adults were worth money for their meat and body parts, but live infants were worth a fortune in the illegal wildlife trade. Emma watched in horror as the poachers tried to separate the baby she had rescued from its mother. The infant was clinging desperately to its mother's back while she tried to shield it from the men's reaching hands. The silverback roared his fury and charged the poachers, but a warning shot fired just over his head forced him back. That's when Emma saw something that filled her with both pride and terror. Her mother gorilla, the female who had trusted her enough to let her save her baby, was positioning herself between the poachers and the rest of the family. Despite being significantly smaller than the silverback, she was taking the most dangerous position, ready to sacrifice herself to protect her child and her family. Emma couldn't watch anymore. These magnificent creatures, who had accepted her as part of their world, were about to be slaughtered or captured, and she was the only human in 50 miles who could help them. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should hide, should wait for help that might never come. But the part of her that had forged an impossible bond with a wild gorilla family demanded action. "Stop!" Emma shouted, stepping into the clearing with her flare gun raised. "Leave them alone!" The 3 poachers spun around, clearly shocked to encounter another human in this remote location. The leader's rifle swung toward Emma, and she found herself staring down the barrel of a weapon that could end her life in an instant. Well, the man said in accented English, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had killed before. "Another do-gooder researcher. You picked the wrong day to play hero, lady." What happened next unfolded with the brutal speed of nature itself. As the poacher's finger tightened on his trigger, the mother gorilla exploded from the forest with a roar that shook leaves from the trees. She had circled around behind the men while they were focused on Emma, using tactics that spoke of intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal instinct. The massive female hit the lead poacher like a freight train, sending his rifle spinning through the air. The man screamed as 300 pounds of muscle and fury drove him to the ground. Powerful hands that could bend steel bars now focused on a target that had threatened her family and her human ally. Chaos erupted in the clearing. The silverback, seeing his mate engaged in battle, charged the second poacher with a fury that was terrible to behold. The man tried to swing his machete, but the blade bounced harmlessly off the gorilla's thick hide before massive fists knocked him unconscious with a single blow. Emma found herself facing the third poacher, who had dropped his net and was reaching for a pistol holstered at his hip. Time seemed to slow as Emma raised her flare gun and pulled the trigger. The emergency flare struck the man square in the chest, burning through his shirt and sending him stumbling backward with screams of pain and shock. But the mother gorilla, was in trouble. The lead poacher, despite being pinned beneath her massive weight, had managed to draw a hunting knife and was stabbing upward, trying to find vital organs. Dark blood was beginning to stain the female's fur, and Emma could hear the change in her vocalizations. The sound of an animal in pain, but refusing to yield. Emma grabbed the dropped assault rifle, but she had never handled such a weapon before. Her fumbling with the unfamiliar controls cost precious seconds. While the poacher continued his desperate attack on the gorilla who had saved her life, that's when the baby gorilla, the same infant Emma, had pulled from the river weeks before, did something that defied all expectations. The young gorilla, instead of fleeing with the rest of the family, charged toward its mother's attacker with a courage that belied its small size. The poacher, distracted by the unexpected assault from a creature no bigger than a house cat, loosened his grip on the knife just long enough for the mother gorilla to seize his wrist and squeeze. The sound of breaking bones was audible even over the chaos of the battle. The poacher's scream of agony cut through the morning air as his wrist was crushed in a grip that could crack coconuts. The knife fell from his useless fingers, and the mother gorilla finally released him, rising to her full height over his broken form. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Two poachers lay unconscious, their weapons scattered across the forest floor. The third was whimpering and trying to crawl away with his shattered wrist cradled against his chest. The gorilla family had regrouped at the edge of the clearing, the silverback standing guard, while the females and young huddled together in the safety of the tree line. But victory had come at a cost. The mother gorilla, Emma's protector and ally, was bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Dark red blood matted her fur along her left side and arm, and she was clearly favoring her injuries as she moved. She had risked her life to save Emma, just as Emma had once risked hers to save her baby. Emma approached the wounded gorilla slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. The mother gorilla watched her approach with eyes that held pain, but no fear. She trusted Emma, even in her wounded state, even after the violence they had just survived together. "Let me help you," Emma whispered, pulling medical supplies from her backpack. She had basic field medicine training and a well-stocked first aid kit. But treating a wild gorilla was far beyond anything she had ever attempted. The mother gorilla allowed Emma to examine her wounds, occasionally wincing as gentle fingers probed the injuries, but never showing aggression toward her human ally. The baby gorilla, the catalyst for their entire relationship, sat nearby, watching with those expressive dark eyes as Emma cleaned and bandaged its mother's wounds. Working by instinct and desperation, Emma managed to stop the worst of the bleeding and apply antiseptic to prevent infection. The gorilla's natural healing ability would have to do the rest. As Emma worked, she talked softly to her patient, explaining what she was doing, even though the words had no literal meaning to the gorilla. But her tone, gentle, caring, worried, communicated everything that mattered. When Emma finished her makeshift medical treatment, the mother gorilla looked directly into her eyes and made that same soft, musical sound she had made by the river weeks before. It was a sound of gratitude, of recognition, of bonds that transcended the barriers between species. The injured poachers were another problem entirely. Emma used their own equipment to tie them up, then dragged them to her cabin where she could finally get a signal on her satellite phone. The park rangers would arrive within hours to arrest the men and take them away to face justice. The immediate threat to the gorilla family was over, but as Emma watched the gorillas disappear back into the forest, the mother moving slowly but steadily despite her injuries, she knew that this victory was temporary. There would be other poachers, other threats, other battles to fight. The bond she had forged with this remarkable gorilla family had drawn her into a war she never expected to fight. A war for the survival of some of Earth's most magnificent creatures. 2 weeks after the poacher attack, Emma thought the worst was behind them. The mother gorilla's wounds were healing well, and the family had returned to their normal routines. The park rangers had increased patrols in the area, and the captured poachers were awaiting trial in the capital city. Emma had even managed to complete some actual research, documenting the extraordinary behavioral adaptations she had witnessed. But on a humid afternoon in late October, Emma's fragile sense of security was shattered by a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive crack of a high-powered sniper rifle fired from a distance. Emma dropped the data sheets she had been organizing and grabbed her binoculars, scanning the forest canopy for any sign of the shot's origin. That's when she saw movement in the trees about 400 yards from her station. A camouflaged figure with a scope-mounted rifle, positioned for a long-range shot at something in the valley below. Following the rifle's line of sight, Emma spotted her gorilla family in a small clearing, completely exposed to the hidden shooter. The mother gorilla was foraging peacefully with her baby, unaware of the danger targeting them from the hillside above. The sniper had a perfect shot, and from this distance, there would be no warning, no chance for escape. Emma's mind raced through her limited options. She was too far away to warn the gorillas, too far away to physically interfere with the shooter. Her satellite phone had no signal from inside the cabin, and by the time she could reach higher ground to call for help, it would be too late. The sniper was already adjusting his position, preparing for a shot that would kill the remarkable creature who had saved Emma's life. In desperation, Emma grabbed her flare gun and a handful of emergency flares. If she could create enough distraction, enough noise and chaos, maybe she could spoil the sniper's shot and give the gorillas time to escape. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was all she had. Emma burst from her cabin and ran toward the sniper's position, firing flares into the air and shouting at the top of her lungs. The bright red explosions and her screaming voice echoed through the forest, immediately alerting every animal within miles that danger was present. The sniper, caught completely off guard by Emma's unexpected assault, swung his rifle toward this new threat. Through her binoculars, Emma could see his face, weathered, professional, with the cold eyes of someone who killed for money. This wasn't some desperate poacher looking for bushmeat. This was a big-game hunter, probably hired by a wealthy collector who wanted a mountain gorilla trophy. "You want to shoot something?" Emma screamed across the valley. "Shoot me, you coward! Leave them alone!" The hunter's rifle tracked toward Emma, and she realized with crystal clarity that she was about to die. She was standing in the open, completely exposed, facing a professional killer with a high-powered weapon. But her sacrifice would give the gorillas time to escape, and in that moment, that seemed like a fair trade. The rifle shot that split the morning air came from an unexpected direction. The mother gorilla had circled around behind the hunter with the silent stealth of a creature evolved for survival in dangerous territory. While Emma had been creating a distraction in the valley below, the massive female had climbed the hillside, using her intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach the sniper from his blind side. The hunter's first indication that he was no longer the predator came when 300 pounds of muscle and fury exploded. From the undergrowth behind him, his rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as the mother gorilla's powerful arms wrapped around his torso, lifting him off his feet with contemptuous ease. Emma watched in awe and terror as her protector, wounded, exhausted, but absolutely determined, engaged in single combat with the most dangerous threat her family had ever faced. The hunter was a large man, well-trained and equipped with military-grade weapons, but he might as well have been fighting a force of nature itself. The gorilla's strategy was brutally simple and effective. She disarmed the hunter by the straightforward method of crushing his hands until he could no longer grip his weapons. His screams echoed across the valley as bones snapped under pressure that could crack walnuts. When he tried to reach for a backup pistol, she simply squeezed harder until he passed out from the pain. But the hunter had one last card to play. As consciousness faded, he managed to activate a fragmentation grenade he had been carrying as a last resort. The explosive device tumbled from his limp fingers with its pin already pulled. giving both combatants only seconds to escape the blast radius. The mother gorilla, with intelligence that continued to astound Emma, immediately recognized the threat. Instead of fleeing to save herself, she grabbed the unconscious hunter and hurled him as far from her family's territory as her powerful arms could manage. The man's body disappeared into a ravine just as the grenade exploded, the blast echoing through the mountains like thunder. When the smoke cleared, the mother gorilla was down. Shrapnel from the explosion had caught her across the chest and legs, adding new wounds to the injuries she was still healing from the previous attack. Dark blood stained the forest floor as she struggled to rise, her breath coming in labored gasps. Emma ran toward her fallen ally, tears streaming down her face. This magnificent creature had saved her life repeatedly, had protected her with the same fierce devotion she showed her own offspring. Now she was dying because she had chosen to fight for a human rather than retreat to safety. Emma's field medical training had never prepared her for trauma surgery on a critically wounded gorilla, but she had no choice but to try. Working with hands that shook from adrenaline and grief, she applied pressure to the worst wounds while calling desperately on her satellite phone for medical evacuation. The response was not encouraging. The nearest veterinarian with gorilla experience was in the capital, over 300 miles away. Even if a helicopter could reach them immediately, the flight time alone would be nearly 2 hours. The mother gorilla didn't have 2 hours, but as Emma worked to save her life, something extraordinary happened. The baby gorilla, now slightly larger and stronger than when Emma had first pulled it from the river, approached its wounded mother and began to help. The infant, guided by instincts Emma couldn't fully understand, began grooming its mother's wounds, licking away blood and debris with a gentleness that spoke of deep intelligence and love. The silverback patriarch of the family also emerged from the forest, along with 2 other females and several juveniles. Instead of fleeing from the human who had brought violence into their world, they formed a protective circle around their wounded matriarch and the human who was trying to save her. Emma found herself performing emergency surgery in the most surreal, operating theater imaginable, surrounded by a family of wild gorillas who watched her every move with keen intelligence, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like encouragement. Against all odds, Emma managed to stabilize the mother gorilla's condition. The bleeding stopped. The worst wounds were cleaned and closed, and the patient's breathing became more regular. But the gorilla was still critically weak. An infection remained a serious threat. That's when Emma made a decision that would have cost her career if her superiors had known about it. She retrieved a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics from her emergency medical kit, medicine intended for human use in case of serious illness or injury. Calculating dosages based on the gorilla's estimated body weight, Emma began a treatment regimen that was completely outside any approved protocol. For 3 days and nights, Emma maintained a bedside vigil with her patient. She monitored vital signs, administered medication, and provided the kind of round-the-clock care that would have been impressive in a modern hospital. Let alone in the middle of the African wilderness, the baby gorilla rarely left its mother's side, and Emma found herself caring for both of them. She shared her food with the infant, made sure it stayed warm at night, and even found herself grooming it in the same way she had seen the mother do. The barriers between species seemed to dissolve entirely during those critical days. On the 4th morning, Emma woke to find the mother gorilla sitting upright, alert and clearly on the road to recovery. The powerful female looked at Emma with those expressive dark eyes and made the soft, musical sound that had become their private language of gratitude and recognition. But this time, there was something different in that vocalization. It sounded like goodbye. The mother gorilla was strong enough to travel, and her family needed to move on. The recent violence had made this territory unsafe, and the natural instincts that had kept mountain gorillas alive for millions of years demanded that they find a new, more secure home range. Emma understood, even as her heart broke at the prospect of losing the most meaningful relationship of her life. She had become part of this family through extraordinary circumstances, but she was still human, still an outsider in the world of the wild. The gorillas belonged to the forest, not to the research station where Emma collected her data and wrote her reports. The farewell took place in the same clearing where Emma had first rescued the baby gorilla from drowning, where their impossible bond had first been forged. The entire family was present, the silverback patriarch, the recovering mother, the baby who had started it all, and the extended family who had accepted Emma as one of their own. Each gorilla approached Emma in turn, touching her gently with fingers that could crush stone, but chose instead to express something that looked remarkably like affection. The baby gorilla, now confident and healthy, climbed into Emma's lap one last time, making the soft chirping sounds that meant contentment and safety in gorilla language. But it was the mother's farewell that broke Emma's heart. The massive female approached slowly, her wounds still healing, but her spirit as strong as ever. She reached out with one enormous hand and gently touched Emma's face, those dark eyes holding all the wisdom and warmth that had made their relationship possible. Then she made a sound Emma had never heard before, not the musical tone of gratitude, not the warning calls of danger, but something deeper and more complex. It was a sound that spoke of bonds that transcended species, of love that knew no biological boundaries, of a connection that would last long after they parted. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "for trusting me, for protecting me, for showing me what it means to be truly wild." The mother gorilla stepped back and, in a gesture that was unmistakably deliberate, bowed her great head toward Emma. It was a sign of respect between equals, acknowledgement of what they had shared and what they had overcome together. Then, without looking back, the family turned and walked into the forest. Emma watched until they disappeared into the green shadows, carrying with them a piece of her heart and leaving behind memories that would sustain her for the rest of her life. Emma remained in the clearing for a long time after they were gone, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to process everything that had happened. She had come to Africa as a scientist, seeking to observe and understand. She was leaving as something different, someone who had been forever changed by contact with a kind of intelligence and nobility she had never imagined possible. 6 months later, Dr. Emma Hayes stood before a packed auditorium at Stanford University, delivering what would become one of the most influential lectures in the history of primatology. Her presentation, titled "Beyond Observation, When the Line Between Researcher and Subject Disappears," would fundamentally change how scientists approach the study of great apes. But Emma's real audience wasn't the academics in the lecture hall. It was the memory of a mother gorilla who had taught her that intelligence, emotion, and nobility existed in forms she had never expected to encounter. Every word she spoke, every photograph she shared, every data point she analyzed was a tribute to a family of wild gorillas who had accepted her as one of their own. The research station in Sangha National Park now bears Emma's name, and it has become a model for ethical wildlife research that prioritizes the well-being of the animals being studied. Her published papers on gorilla cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence have been cited thousands of times, forming the foundation for new approaches to conservation and animal welfare. But perhaps more importantly, Emma's story has inspired a new generation of researchers who understand that true knowledge comes not from maintaining distance, but from building relationships based on respect and trust. Her work has shown that the greatest discoveries often happen when we stop trying to study nature and start trying to understand it. The poaching trade that once threatened the gorillas of Central Africa has been significantly reduced through better enforcement and international cooperation. The specific family that Emma lived with has been spotted several times by other researchers, thriving in a protected area deeper in the forest. Park rangers report that the distinctive female larger than most gorillas of her sex and bearing the scars of her battles, appears to be teaching her young ones to recognize and trust certain humans, passing on the lessons she learned from her relationship with Emma. Emma herself returned to Africa many times over the following years, always hoping for one more encounter with her gorilla family. She never saw them again, but she often felt their presence in the forest, watching, protecting, remembering. The bond they had forged transcended physical presence, becoming something deeper and more lasting than simple friendship. This story is about more than one woman and one gorilla family. It's about the connections that exist between all living things when we have the courage to recognize them. It's about the intelligence and emotion that surround us in the natural world, waiting to be acknowledged and respected, rather than simply studied and catalogued. Emma's journey reminds us that the greatest adventures don't always involve conquering nature. Sometimes they involve surrendering to it, allowing ourselves to be changed by contact with forms of life we never expected to understand. Her story shows us that heroism isn't always about dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's about the quiet decision to help when help is needed, regardless of the personal cost. The mother gorilla who saved Emma's life multiple times was following the same instinct that led Emma to jump into a raging river to save a drowning infant. It was the recognition that all life has value, that protecting others is worth any personal risk, and that the bonds between living creatures can be stronger than the boundaries between species. In our modern world, where technology often separates us from the natural environment, Emma's story serves as a powerful reminder of what we lose when we forget our connection to the wild world. It shows us that intelligence, emotion, and nobility exist in many forms, and that our role as humans should be to protect and preserve these magnificent expressions of life on Earth. The research legacy that Emma built continues to grow, inspiring new discoveries about animal intelligence, emotion, and social behavior. But perhaps her greatest legacy is simpler and more profound: the proof that love and respect can bridge any gap, overcome any difference, and create bonds that last forever. This incredible journey from a drowning baby gorilla to a life-changing bond between species reminds us that the most important stories are often the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew about the world around us. Emma Hayes didn't just study gorillas. She learned from them, was protected by them, and ultimately became part of their family in ways that science textbooks never could have prepared her for. But stories like this are becoming rarer every day. The wild places where such encounters are possible are shrinking. The animals that could teach us so much are disappearing, and the opportunities for genuine connection between humans and nature are vanishing with alarming speed. That's why channels like Wind Echo Untold exist, to share these remarkable stories, to celebrate the incredible intelligence and emotion of the animals we share this planet with, and to inspire a new generation of people who understand that protecting the natural world isn't just about conservation statistics. It's about preserving the possibility for connections that can change lives and expand our understanding of what it means to be alive on this extraordinary planet. If Emma's story moved you, if it made you see gorillas, and perhaps all animals, in a new light, then I need you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that the natural world still has incredible stories to tell us. Share this video with someone who loves animals, someone who needs to hear about the courage of a researcher who risked everything to save a drowning baby, and the gratitude of a mother who never forgot that kindness. Leave a comment telling us about a time when you connected with a wild animal, even if it was just for a moment. Maybe it was a bird that landed near you, a deer that didn't run away, or a moment when you felt truly part of the natural world around you. These connections matter more than we often realize, and sharing them helps remind all of us that we're part of something much larger and more wonderful than our daily human concerns. Most importantly, remember Emma's lesson, that the greatest discoveries often come not from maintaining distance, but from having the courage to care, to help, and to recognize that the intelligence and emotion we value in ourselves exist throughout the natural world, in forms we're only beginning to understand. The bond between Emma Hayes and a family of mountain gorillas proves that some connections transcend every boundary we think exists between species. Their story reminds us that in a world where such connections are still possible, every day holds the potential for wonder, for discovery, and for the kind of love that changes everything. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the extraordinary stories happening all around us in the wild world we're privileged to share with creatures like Emma's remarkable gorilla family. The next amazing story is just waiting to be discovered.